right. Hi, guys. Welcome to the second SILA Foundation webinar of 2020. We're so happy that you were able to join us today. We have a big group, so for that reason, we will be saving questions for the end, although feel free to ask any questions you have along the way in the chat box that is available to you. There's also a Q&A box. We'll watch both of them. So if you've got questions along the way, but in the meantime, let me introduce our speaker. Dawn Kuhlman is the Executive Director of MARCH, which stands for Mediation Achieving Results for Children. She's serving families in the state of Missouri. She also owns Kuhlman Conflict Solutions, specializing in mediation and trainings in various topics, such as communication, perspective taking, empowerment, forgiveness, and emotion regulation. I mean, who doesn't need some training in forgiveness and emotion regulation? I mean, we just all survived Super Tuesday. I don't know about you guys, but that was pretty good. Dawn is president and founder of Humankind Incorporated, a nonprofit, and teaches advanced mediation at Johnson County Community College. She holds a master's in clinical psychology from Ball State. Dawn's both a Missouri and Kansas Supreme Court approved mediator. She's trained thousands over the past 15 years on various topics such as mediation, personality type, domestic violence, non-defensive communication, trauma, conflict coaching, emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and high conflict personalities. Not that we know any of those. So, Dawn, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thanks so much for being with us.
Okay, hello, I'm excited. So yes, there's a snapshot of what I do, a little bit about me. And like she said, I've been a mediator for 17 years now. And so a lot of the information that I'm going to bring to you today is really just a mashup of everything that I've learned over the 17 years of dealing with people in conflict. And, you know, for a long time, I'd probably say for a decade, I was dealing with people in conflict, and they would be frothing at the mouth, sweating, totally pitted out, yelling at each other. And I was feeling helpless and out of control, if you will, not knowing how to best help folks. And so today you get like a 1-hour mashup of everything that I've learned, if you will, and how we can better understand people, how we can better understand ourselves. That's certainly going to be some of what we do today. And we do it in a fun way. I'm kind of quirky, so hopefully we can, but it's hard in a webinar. We were talking about this yesterday, some colleagues and I, like when you do a one-on-one or you do trainings and it's live, obviously it's a little bit different than when you do a webinar. So it's like I tell a joke and then I have to laugh at my own jokes. Anyway, it's kind of awkward. So one of the things that changed my life was this book, The Body Keeps the Score. And I'm a storyteller, I'm a self-discloser, I'm all the things that are probably inappropriate. But anyway, so it was probably about 2013, and I was really starting to come to understand this word trauma. And it's going to sound like a big, scary word. Hopefully I'll find ways to make it a little bit more approachable, if you will, a little bit, help us understand it a little bit better today. But I was helping folks or trying to help people talk who had maybe a history of trauma. And obviously, I think a lot of us have our own stuff as well, right? And so I'm reading this book, The Body Keeps the Score, and I'm just totally blown away when I'm learning about the mind-body experience in terms of how we respond when life is difficult or challenging, or we have chronic stress, things of those nature, and in terms of the brain-body response. And so, and this is a true story. When I read the book, like the right side of my face went numb, and my therapist was like, I think you should read that book in small doses, Dawn. And I was like, yeah, it's probably a good idea. So anyway, that's what I ended up doing. So FYI, if you have a somatic experiencing, if you will, psychosomatic experiencing, whenever you're reading the book, maybe read it in small doses. That's a little tip from me. So just to kind of jump into this, because part of what in my journey to learn more about people in conflict, I started down this path in terms of understanding what's called the ACE study. And ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And it was actually done, I think, in like 1997 by the CDC, and they had produced all these results. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris she's the Surgeon General in California. She's on a huge campaign to have people understand the ACEs, and it's really starting to spread all across the US in terms of understanding how what you've been through in terms of your life experience can have a huge impact on terms of your health, your mental health, and then in terms of how I'm going to relate it today, emotion regulation, conflict resolution, all those buzzwords, if you will. But what the study found was that emotional, this trauma when you were a kiddo, and let's talk about real fast. The ACE is 10 questions, and you can Google it when you're done with me, or you can do it right now, actually. If you Google ACE study, you will find a ton of them. You just get online, you can take it. It's 10 questions. I will tell you some of the questions may be triggering to you in terms of things that may have happened in your past that you kind of bottled up, didn't want to think about it. But the questions are, were you ever sexually abused? Did you live with a parent that had mental health issues? Did anyone in your home abuse substances? These are the what I would consider big ones. Did you have an incarcerated parent? Then we've got, were your parents ever separated or divorced? And obviously, as a divorce mediator, that's a huge one for me. I'm like, God, that's an ACE. Because I feel like we as a society has kind of normalized this idea of divorce, if you will. But for us, you have to understand, this is a traumatic event for kids in terms of their brain really doesn't have the ability to cope with the separation of their parents. They don't really know, the brain doesn't know what to do with that. And that's a lot of what this is in terms of the brain just doesn't know what to do with these events and how to respond to them. So what they found was that the higher your ACE score, meaning the more life events that you went through, then you're related to higher amounts of chronic disease, higher amounts of mental health issues, things of that nature. And I think that ties into what I see in my office in terms of the higher the ACE score, the less of the ability to communicate appropriately, impulse control issues, yelling in my office. And I've never formally administered the ACE study in terms of my clients, but it does help me have some compassion. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking with you today in terms of reframing some of how we view people so we can maybe begin to have some understanding in terms of why people are responding a certain way. So, like I said, huge link between childhood trauma and social emotional problems. Obviously, on the surface, that's really not a huge epiphany, but the fact that there's like so much research to support all this, it's really hard to deny it at this point. So, in my mind, I think when I talked about the ACE just now, we talked about what I would call big T traumas, right? They have intense fear, feeling helplessness, loss of control. That is when the brain starts to have this shift in terms of like, mayday, mayday, something's wrong. So there's also what's called small T traumas. And this is where I'm going to share a horrible story about myself where I have inflicted a small T trauma on someone else. So I went down to Florida 2 years ago, and I graduated high school. Actually, I went from Indianapolis, but went to high school in Ohio for most of my life. Anyways, visiting my high school friends from Ohio, but we were down in Florida. I know, life is crazy. And we're sitting in this bar, swear to God, one of my good friends, John, he's telling me a story about when we were 14 years old, okay? And I'm like drinking my beer, listening to John tell me how I basically inflicted small T trauma on him. So apparently we were hanging out at my parents' house, and John goes number two. I had a bathroom next to my room. John goes number two, and I totally start like giving him crap about pooping in my house. All right. And I don't even recall this event. Oh my gosh, my laptop just fell over. I don't even recall this event, right? Like John is giving me crap at this bar, and I'm like, John, I gave you a small T trauma now that I'm like knowledgeable of what happened here. And he says to me, Dawn, it's probably not a big deal. I probably shouldn't be pooping in public anyway. Okay, so here's something else. Most of us have about 15 to 20 small T traumas in our life, right? Like we all like have experienced something in our life, whether it was a snarky comment from someone, something in our childhood, it could be something when we were adult, it causes a shift in our brain, right? We immediately don't know how to cope with it. So it's not like we go around meaning to inflict small t traumas on people, but sometimes we do, right? And I often think of it like we just mindlessly go around saying and doing things and not thinking about the impact that it has on people. I think it is imperative, and I'll talk about this later, to really start to practice. And this is where I'm going to start using some buzzwords of like mindfulness, but thinking about how what we're saying, what we're doing is impacting others. And so, like I said, a lot of us probably have a handful of small t traumas in our life. A lot of you are probably thinking in your mind, yeah, I remember sixth grade, such and such, whatever. And that cannot be minimized. That can cause a shift in the brain in terms of at the time, your brain didn't know how to process what it was going through. And so sometimes when the brain doesn't know how to process it, it just stays stuck, right? And so I'll talk about where it stays stuck at and how that can have some further consequences on us in terms of our brain. So this is an almond, right? And the reason why I'm showing you an almond is because in our brain, we have what's called the amygdala. And we actually have two of these, right? So like imagine here's my brain, I've got two amygdalas in there. And the amygdala has an amazing job, right? Its job is to fight, flight, freeze, right? So in terms of if you see a lion, you are going to run, and that's based upon the amygdala response. Like the amygdala fires, you go off, here we go. This was really helpful when we were in our caveman days, right? Well, we are no longer there. However, the brain continues to provide us with this excellent service, if you will. And the trick is, though, is that I compare the amygdala to like a fire alarm or a smoke alarm, if you will. So in your kitchen, you have let's say a bacon fire. A bacon fire is going on, or just you've burnt bacon. How about that? Let's start with that. Keep it simple. You've burnt some bacon. There is smoke going off in the house. You're trying to open the windows, the doors, whatever. Smoke alarm is going off, but there's really no fire. Okay. Now, the issue is if you really did have a bacon fire in your house, the smoke alarm would go off just the same, right? That's the same with the amygdala. It can't differentiate whether this is smoke or whether this is a real fire. And so I call that like the fear-driven part of the brain. That's where we're looking at responses like fight, flight, freeze. The most common of these responses is the freeze component. Excuse me, and I will say, I think all of us, and a lot of people are surprised by that. And I think it just depends on your personality, because some people will say fight, you know, like the competitive nature in people. But technically in society in general, it's the freeze response. And I liken it to the idea of how somebody can say something snarky to me or something hurtful, maybe even passive aggressive. And then like 2 days later, I'll be like, oh, and I'll think about like a really good response to that event that happened 2 days ago. Yeah. Do not reply 2 days later, just FYI. That's it makes you look crazy then, but that does indicate in terms of like how the brain is functioning, like what is going on with the brain. It's just the normal, your amygdala fired, you were frozen, you couldn't really think of a response, and it takes your brain time to calm down. One of my favorite visuals that I like to use with my clients or when I'm giving trainings is really, I hear if you can see it, a snow globe. And when you shake a snow globe, clearly you can see how things just start floating around, right? Well, I liken that to like when the amygdala fires, and imagine this is your brain, right? And we've got to have time to calm down. And so sometimes in my sessions, if somebody says something and it creates a hurtful response, or if there's a lot of emotion, sometimes I'll use this and I'll just say, let's just wait until this dies down before we talk again, you know? And I feel like that when the amygdala has fired and we've had a strong emotional response, it takes the brain sometimes 20 to 60 minutes to calm back down. And I often think about how much damage people do in those 20 to 60 minutes of time. And so just trying to keep that in mind in terms of when you are having a strong emotional response, just think about that snow globe and don't send emails, don't call, don't text, don't do anything. Just wait it out. And oftentimes it's often suggested to wait like 24 hours before you send an email or reply to something that's caused a strong emotional response. And truthfully, it's because your brain, and I'm going to talk about this here in a second in the next slide, you can't function out of your amygdala and out of your prefrontal cortex at the same time. Like it's just not possible. And so when you can actually get your brain to calm back down and you can function out of the prefrontal cortex, that's when it's a good time to engage. And there's a reason, there's a lot of function that happens up here that I'll talk about here in a moment. But there was a really good movie on Amazon Prime that's called Paper Tigers. And one of the things that I love about that movie is it deals with kids who are in an alternative school. And a lot of these kids have high ACE scores. And it likens it to basically these kiddos can't differentiate between paper tigers and real tigers, right? And I feel like that we often sometimes, like as a society, will do that. We can't differentiate, or even, and I pick on my husband a lot because he's got some high anxiety, and I literally will ask him this now. I'm like, is this a real issue or is this an issue that you've made up? And I don't want to say made up, but that's kind of what our brain does. Like our brain will take this anxiety, take this stress, and create an issue that really may or may not be there. And before I really started learning this, I used to get wrapped up in his stuff. And then like a day later, it wouldn't be an issue for him anymore. And then I'd be like, well, how? So I got tired of getting wrapped up and caring more about his issues that really weren't real issues. Anyway, that's a conversation for another day. But I think it is helpful sometimes to ask ourselves, is this a real issue? And I think it would be, interesting to think about in terms of when we think about, is this a paper tiger or a real tiger? But when you think about people who have had maybe some high adverse childhood experiences, and I always think of them like on a continuum. And let's say like this is a 1 and this is a 10, and you have a high ACE score, or you've had some really stressful life events, your amygdala has probably been firing a lot and over the course of your lifetime. And so you're probably a hyper vigilant person. You're extremely reactive. And so I think of them like operating at like between a 5 and an 8, maybe in their everyday life. And then one small event happens and this person gets shoved over the edge, right? Just this inability to cope or deal or think about how to respond because they're already revved up. Like that's their natural baseline, if you will. And so part of healing and treatment is finding ways to calm the brain body system. And obviously, I mean, I'm a huge advocate for mindfulness, what's called brain-based therapies. And I don't even want to get into that, but talk therapy cannot heal the brain. There are special brain-based therapies that I think we really should start talking about as a society. But like I said, I'm not going to go on that soapbox today, but I do want to plant the seed on that. And so again, differentiate, is this real or is this not? The other thing I like to think about in terms of communication and helping people trying to navigate, is it a real threat? Is it not? How can I stay focused type thing? Is I will draw continuums in my mediation sessions. And so on this continuum, I'm a huge continuum user. In this continuum, on the one hand, I'll have like the past. And then on this side of the continuum, I'll have like the future. And in the middle, I've got the present. And every time that I'm trying to talk to them about a conversation here in the present, they go to the past. And I'll tell you what, we go off charts in terms of emotions, because typically when people go to the past, it is filled with blame, negative emotions, sadness, hate, fear, everything you could think of that's over there. And it's hard to get people, because that's when the amygdala is firing, right? You go to the past, the amygdala fires. It's hard to get people to focus, to have conversations. And so again, my job is to try to calm that brain down. We're talking about emotion regulation skills, calming the brain down so people can come back and start to have conversations about what's real, what's true, what can be solved. Because if you're having conversations about stuff that's in the past, there's no way to change that, right? I mean, we can try to say we're sorry, there's things that we can do, but there's no magic wand to change the past. So going back in that direction is not going to do anybody any good, right? So on the flip side of it, we go conversations about the future. This is where people start just making stuff up in terms of like the what ifs and the anxiety. This is where that's the emotions and the stress that we tend to have down here when we have future conversations, is this fear of the unknown, right? So there is some fear that's legitimate, but some people become so frozen by that fear that they're afraid to make any moves in the present, right? And so trying to find ways to find that sweet spot of, we are here now trying to have conversations that are about real things in real time, and how can we take a step towards making a choice today that's going to get us to somewhere in the future, right? And so thinking about all of that, like just putting all of that together and thinking about how it ties into the amygdala, I think is very helpful when you're thinking about communication, when you're thinking about conflict resolution. So the prefrontal cortex. And I often joke that I'm afraid I might lose credibility when I say this, but Goldie Hawn has come up with a program called the Mind Up program. And it's basically positive psychology, but it's the social and emotional learning for kids. And I do think there's a lot to be said about this in terms of kids go to school every day, they learn math, social studies, all these other things. Why aren't they learning social and emotional learning? Like, why isn't this part of a curriculum? And there are a handful of schools who are doing their own versions of social and emotional learning, and it's producing awesome results. My youngest daughter is actually part of like a conscious discipline initiative that was done here in our Liberty School District. I'm in Liberty, Missouri, just outside of Kansas City. And every morning they would start with gratitude. They would put their fears up on the board. They did a lot of cool stuff. And that's rewiring the brain for positiveness. That's rewiring the brain for emotion regulation. It's getting the stress out of these kids, helping them focus on positive. And I'm going to talk some more about that. But what a wonderful way to start your day. I'm like, man, we should all start our day like that. So, but Goldie Hawn talks about how basically we need to get out of the amygdala. We need to start using the prefrontal cortex. And there's a video on YouTube. If you Google Mind Up, it's a 6-minute video, super great video. It's of these little kids talking about how when they read books, how the characters in the books, the teachers will ask, are the characters using their amygdala, or are they using their prefrontal cortex? And so the kids are talking about this, and they talk about how they're using these deep breathing techniques that they're using at the school. And they've taken them home and they're using them with their parents. They're using them with their sister who gets anxiety. And I feel like this is good stuff. Like, this is the direction we need to be moving in terms of just the lofty goal of making our world a better place. But again, I'm like, if 6-year-olds can do this, then anyone can do this, you know, but we really should start young. It's a lot easier to keep and maintain using tools versus trying to teach new tools when people are older, right? But I'm not afraid to use emotion regulation techniques in my mediations, such as deep breathing. And I'll often have some people do some deep breath in. I'll say, you know, like, smell the flower, and then I'll blow out the candle. And then I often have them do a component of where I will have them say, I am safe and I am in control. Because when the fear-driven brain is operating, we don't feel safe. We don't feel in control. And so self-talk is probably one of the most powerful tools that we can use to help regulate our emotions. And if we are with people who don't have the ability to regulate their emotions, then we need to help them with that. And that's where using these tools can come into play in terms of, you know, I do with my kids when they're having anxiety about things, have them practice, I am safe, I am in control. So thinking about the prefrontal cortex, it is connected to problem solving, logic, attention, and it's really efficient in terms of predicting consequences of actions. Isn't that a powerful statement right there? And true story, I did a mediation with a guy. He had a traumatic brain injury, and he was actually missing a portion of his prefrontal lobe. And I went into it very scared because I knew it wasn't going to end well. And I was right, right? Like I predicted pretty much what was going to happen. Just an inability to problem solve, inability to stay present. It was everything that I've talked about before in terms of the challenges that can happen. And that's the other thing to take into consideration. I mean, if there's been any sort of brain damage, even a concussion, oh man, that movie Concussion, talk about issues with the brain and emotion regulation, that there's a lot of evidence for all of that. But again, a brain-based treatment for that is called neurofeedback, which is amazing. And they've actually been using neurofeedback with folks of the ex-Denver football players, Broncos. Um, and there's, I have a TED talk on trauma-informed mediation that's created all around this. And in that TED talk, I show my brain because I did neurofeedback for, I've done it for like 3 or 4 years now. And it's just a really good way, you know, when your brain gets dysregulated, the brain waves can get off. And there's so many amazing methods of technology now to heal the brain that there's really no reason why we all shouldn't just be walking around with some really good healed brains. Anyway, that's another story too for another day, right? So now that you know all of this about the brain, and I think it helps when we can start to reframe things, right? So the reframe, and this is what I use in my mediation sessions. It says turd polish. You see that, right? That's what a reframe is. It is where we take like this turd that's been given to us and we shine it up and then we present it back, right? So in terms of when we're dealing with people who are just challenging, um, you take that turd in, polish it up, and reframe it out in your brain in terms of how can I deal with this? And so it's really easy to take this judgy stance on like, this person's just effed up, or what is wrong with them, right? Like those are easy ways to say, to deal with that. The hard approach is the compassionate lens, is like, what happened to that person, right? Like, what in the heck? So we've got to keep that in mind in terms of people have been through a lot. All of us have been through a lot. None of us know what we're doing. And so just taking that compassionate lens, and I'm not saying that we should excuse or condone poor behavior. Like I don't believe in victims. I believe in accountability. Like there's a lot of things that I believe in. However, I also know that if people truly don't have the skills or the resources, how can I link them with skills and resources to help them, right? And that's the other part of my whole thing, like knowing about who can help in the community, how can we all be connected and help each other. That's a huge focus of how I like to live my life. So one more thing about the brain in terms of just thinking about this fancy word neuroplasticity, and the basic definition of that is just the brain's ability to change, right? So just the same as the brain has the ability to change when placed in a bad environment, the brain has the ability to change when placed in a good environment or when looking at things through a different lens, right? That's the beauty of neuroplasticity. We used to just think, oh, you've had some crappy stuff happen to you that you gotta learn how to deal with that. That is not the case anymore, thank God. You know, we've really have learned to figure out how to help the brain heal. But one of the interesting things that I learned, and I actually learned this in a mindfulness book, that's also been part of my journey in terms of how to incorporate mindfulness into my life and all that I'm doing here. But there's this thing called implicit memory. And so what that is a picture of is a piece of paper. And I'm gonna pull out a piece of paper for you. And so here's a blank sheet of paper. And so think of like a newborn baby coming out. Speaking of babies, listen to me, I'm talking to you like you know. This new Netflix series, Babies, I watched 2 episodes last night and I'm loving it. They've got sensors on these babies' brains. They're relating it to like how people parent. And then that parenting has been related to how the brain develops. They talk about the amygdala in parenting. There were so many things last night that I was like just totally gobbling up. So if anybody has a chance to watch Babies on Netflix, it is super interesting. And it is a lot of everything that I'm talking to you about. So super neat stuff. And yeah, I don't even want to keep talking about it, but it's very interesting. So imagine this is a baby brain and it is establishing what I would call like neural connections. So let's say something happens in the environment and then there's neural connections like this that happen. It's like a chain, right? And so when there are events that continue to happen, you get more neural connections and it gets thicker. Almost like you're going from dial up to broadband as the time goes and like the events keep happening and you keep getting a thicker connection. So I envision the brain like this. So let's say this child is learning how to eat for the first time, like putting food up to his or her mouth, right? So we're establishing neural connections. This is a piece of paper. This is the information highway in the brain, right? So we're going to go again and we're going to look here at another connection that's being formed. And this is all around eating, right? Here we go. This is the baby's brain. How cool is that? And so then you open it up and then now we have that same person, let's say they're in their 20s and now they are eating, driving down the road, talking on the phone, doing all these things because the neural connections have already been established. You don't have to do a mindfulness in terms of learning to eat, right? So that's the good thing. Once these neural connections have been established, you don't have to think about anything. You can just kind of mindlessly go about your day. And there's times, when I'm driving down the road and I get to a place and I'm like, I don't remember the drive here. Like, holy crap. And that's because you are mindlessly going, right? You've had these neural connections. You know where you're going. You don't have to consciously think about where you are going. Super cool stuff. Now, this is good when you're doing good stuff, right? When you're not having to think about everything. The challenge is when this brain has been wired like this on things that are not helpful. And when you think about the birth to age 4 are really the prime developmental years of brain development, right? There's later it all happens. It continues to happen, but you think about how much, and then the babies thing, they talk about that too. Just like birth to age 4 is just monumental in terms of how much happens. And if someone has been exposed to things that are not helpful, or if you were 3 years old and you had a parent that said some things to you that weren't helpful, your brain never really know what to do with that. And so that's still at the unconscious level. And so when I talk to people now and they're like, I continue to do the same thing over and over again, and I don't know why. Well, there's something in there that's been wired probably a little off, and it just needs to be redone, needs to be rewired. And there's ways to do that. But when people are just unconsciously continuing to make a bad decision over and over and over again, there's something to be said for that. There's some sort of implicit memory that it's working on. And so I always like to make examples of things. And so let me give you an example of implicit memory in my own home. It's nothing big or anything, but we had decided to renovate our kitchen a handful of years ago. We have now since moved anyway, so that was a whole waste of money. But anyway, so we renovated our kitchen, and obviously when you renovate, we had put in all new custom cabinets and stuff. And so I go to a particular drawer and I open it up, and there is not what I'm looking for in there. And I holler over to my husband because I'm mindlessly just in the kitchen working, right? And I holler over to my husband and I go, what used to be in this drawer? And he tells me what used to be in that drawer. And then I go, that's what I'm looking for. So then I had to go to the new space and get it. That is a prime example of we are just operating at this unconscious level. My friend and I love to have these stupid philosophical discussions about how, really, we think that only 10% of what we're doing is at the conscious level. We really think about 90% of what we're doing is at the unconscious level in terms of just everything that we're doing in life. I think it's true. We made those numbers up, but that I think is a discussion to be had in terms of we're just mindlessly going, right? And if you want to change a behavior, you have to be extremely mindful about it. And I think there's something to be said about that. And I've done lots of talks on change theory and what it takes to change. I mean, it's a whole thing. It takes a lot, like I said, to change something. So the brain is adapting to this behavior. But the tricky part is that often if there's an implicit memory, it is directly connected to the amygdala. And that's what I was making reference to earlier in terms of there are special therapies now. One of them is called EMDR, stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. I know it sounds big and lofty, but it's a really super cool technique to help memories get unstuck in the amygdala, which is what's causing all these strong fear-based responses, and helping them process them so you can put them through sort of the prefrontal cortex, and then you can find logical reasons for it. Extremely cool process. If you've never done it, I highly recommend it, because we usually all have some things that cause some strong emotional responses. But the American Psychological Association has produced like over 20,000 articles that support the effectiveness of EMDR. And you can usually just Google like emdr.org or something like that to find providers in your area. But it really helps deal with implicit memory issues that are connected to strong emotional responses. So, thinking about communication and how this all ties in still. So, when you think about the amygdala firing, you are, as somebody's trying to talk to you, you are perceiving what they are saying as a threat, right? And so then if you are perceiving this as a threat, then you are going to have a strong emotional response to it in terms of wanting to defend yourself, defend someone else, things of that nature. Part of what I always say leads to non-defensive communication is just literally calming the amygdala down. And that's, knowing, just trying to stay calm, doing some deep breathing when you're trying to have obviously some really tough conversations. Part of it is I feel like when we are negative or when our brain is wired to seek out negative things, we are operating out of what I call a deficit-based model. Like we are intentionally seeking or fault finding people, right? That creates defensiveness in others. And people don't want to be around you, like, right? So I think you've all probably seen the Facebook post of like, that person that drained you. That's what I think of when I think of like the deficit base. Like that person is just focusing on the negative in everything. And so Shawn Achor, I'm going to show you guys a book. He has a TED Talk on positive psychology. I think he's like he was a Harvard professor. This is one of his books, Before Happiness. This is the quote I'm going to read to you. But he's done a ton of research on how to rewire your brain for positivity. And so like one of the things that he talks about is how if you do like a gratitude journal every day for 30 days and you write 2 things positive, and it can never be the same 2 things. You have to find 2 new things every day, that you begin to wire your brain for that positivity, right? And so that earlier when I talked about like implicit memory, rewiring, doing change, that's the type of stuff that I'm talking about. Like that's how you can make a change in your brain in terms of what you're focusing on, not always focusing on negative. So and I read this to my clients, like when I'm in mediation with folks, I pull out books, I pull out tools, tips, resources, anything that can help people learn. But this is something that I want us to think about. While the human brain receives 11 million pieces of information every second from our environment, it can process only 40 bits per second, which means it has to choose what tiny percentage of this input to process and attend to, and what huge chunk to dismiss or ignore. Thus, your reality is a choice. What you choose to focus on shapes how you perceive and interpret your world. And then my follow-up question is, where do you want to put your 40 bits, right? I mean, we've got people who sometimes can be draining by just focusing on all the negative of things. And how about we try putting that 40 bits towards something that's going to establish communication that connects us rather than disconnects us. And I really feel like that's sort of been my theme now for 2020. I'm doing a handful of trainings called Communicating to Connect, because Are we really communicating to connect? Or are we communicating to prove that we're right, to defend ourselves, to prove that someone else is wrong? Those aren't ways to communicate to connect. And I feel like as a society, we've got to be making a shift towards connection, um, if we all want to work together, if you will. So, another component of this in terms of what I would call defensive communication is sort of this idea that we have expectations for other people that they don't have for themselves. And so that keeps us stuck. And so the word that I hear the most in conflict in here is should. And I really just want to burn that word, because people want to sit here literally in this chair. I'm usually down there. They will sit here in this chair and throw that word around 52 million times in a mediation session in terms of like what this person across from them should be doing, should not be doing. And truthfully, that's an expectation that you've put on them. And whether or not that person's going to follow through with it or not is, you have no control over it. And so I just sit down there and I'm like, I don't have a magic wand to make this person do something. And they probably should be doing it. But what control do I have? What control does even a judge have? What control does anyone have over someone else's behavior? And I feel like, sometimes I do these circles of like, this is what you have control over. And then guess what? Here's the rest of the world, things you don't have control over. Right. And I don't think people like that a lot. And so then at that point, then there seems to be like a victim mindset that comes with that. Oh, you just do this to me. You keep me stressed. And my whole thing is, I don't want victims in my office. I mean, one, they're draining. And two, I want everyone to feel empowered. And so focusing on what you have control over, focusing on what choices you have, that's the type of stuff that I want to see. And that's how I guide my own life. In terms of, I'm going to focus on what I have control over. I'm not going to focus on the things I don't have control over. It seems like a waste of my energy, resources, money, whatever. And so thinking about ways that you can empower yourself without hurting others, I think is a good focus. And then just to kind of maybe wrap up, yeah, actually it's perfect timing. Wrap up what I've kind of said today in terms of mindfulness. Around that 2013 time, when I really started diving into all of this to better understand the brain, I read a amazing, funny book. If you are put off by cussing, this is not the book for you, but for me, this is extremely funny. Dan Harris, it's his book, 10% Happier. And just as a real quick side story, he actually he was in Afghanistan. He's the ABC News guy, and he actually had a panic attack on TV. And it led him on a journey of mindfulness that he didn't really expect to go on. But now he currently does 2 hours of meditation a day. He does one in the morning and one at night, because that helps his brain. He's got a pretty hardwired brain. He's wired up, if you will. But he was going to Afghanistan all the time, and he became like an adrenaline junkie. And technically, he had post-traumatic stress disorder. And he was coming back and snorting a ton of cocaine and just very self-destructive. And he was completely out of control, which led to the panic attack on air. And so he talks about how he's kind of what skills he's been learning to tame the voices in his head. And so this whole thing between the 10% happier was basically, he's found this thing that he thinks, kind of like when I quantified 90% the unconscious level, same thing with him. He just makes this, he quantified 10%. There's no sort of statistical proof for it, but it's just sort of what we're saying in terms of what we would guess. But he was saying he thinks that this has made him 10% happier in terms of just practicing meditation, being mindful of thoughts, words, behaviors, emotions. I think a lot of us want to stuff. One of the interesting things to me in my sessions are people will say things like, I'm not mad, as they're like sweating and angry. And I think there's like this stigma in terms of having a negative emotion. And my whole perspective is, listen, even dogs get angry, even dogs get jealous. Like, emotions are a natural inborn thing. It's what the heck you do with them that can cause problems, right? So let's not shame people or shame ourselves on having a particular emotion. Part of mindfulness is you accept that emotion, you own it, and then you release it, right? Like, it's like a cloud that evaporates. You just own it, release it. And that way you don't try to suppress or deny it, because that just seems stupid and exhausting. So let's be real about who we are. We're people, we're human, and erase that. I mean, release it back out there. And so he's got 2 books. Dan Harris has got 2. So the first one is basically why mindfulness is helpful. And the second one is his meditation for fidgety skeptics. This is the how-to book. And I don't get any kickback on any of these, FYI. It'd be nice if I knew these people. But these are just some good tools and resources that have really helped me. But the how-to book is really like, it does a lot of like walking you through on how to do some meditations, how to practice mindfulness. One last story on that. Dan Harris's wife, she was trying to figure out ways to incorporate this into her life as well. And one of the fun ideas that they came up with is that she was just going to watch TV and truly watch TV, because what was happening was she was watching TV and then she was trying to answer emails and she was trying to do all these things. And I think the premise behind all of this is that we live now in a society where we feel like we have to be doing 52 million things at once, and we can never be fully present with what we're doing. And so the idea is, if you're going to watch TV, then freaking watch TV, right? Like, enjoy it, be mindful of it, be present with it. And that way you're not all over the place. And I'm guilty of this too, but I think it's certainly beneficial if we can take that time to slow down and actually be present in what we're doing. And it really benefits our brain. So that is it. It looked like we had a couple questions, but
Yeah, there was one question, Dawn, particularly about what is EMDR? What does that stand for again?
eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. And you can get on Amazon, and there'll be all kinds of books on it. Francine Shapiro is the creator of it. And there's lots of kind of testimonials or stories of where it was very helpful to a lot of people. Do I hit stop share? Will that put me on? Will that take that off of there? Yeah.
Not sure.
Anyway.
I think it's fine. All we're seeing is a blank screen and
Okay. Okay.
For the question part. You had started off with one book on the body-mind connection. What was the title of that?
The Body Keeps the Score.
Okay. Well, I think we've gotten, we should just, be thankful for all the resources we've got. We've got Netflix series to watch. We've got.
Oh my gosh. This is my life. I don't know if you can tell that. This is my life.
We have movies to watch, Paper Tigers. We got a YouTube. Mind up.
But yeah, my TED Talk is basically like, this was it. I mean, this was my life for a long time. Just I initially started truthfully to understand myself a little bit better. And then I was like, holy crap, this is what's going on in my sessions. And then I started doing it with my clients, learning about them. And then it all just sort of transpired into, this is a whole model of how we can be working and dealing with people. So anyway.
So a couple of things that occurred to me during the presentation was, I've read recently that emotional pain, trauma, small t, I guess, but emotional pain, like, that kids feel when they're not invited to, you can't sit with us at lunch kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The body experiences that as equally painful.
Yeah.
It's like a real injury.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I didn't even talk about today is that there are ways to heal through the body and not doing brain-based treatments. My colleague was just telling me about this the other day, but there is one type of therapy called somatic experiencing. And I had a colleague who actually did it. She did it with her husband. They just have sessions, and this is going to sound crazy cool. They just have sessions where they touch each other. Because there were particular memories associated, negative memories. And so in order for her husband to be able to touch her, there had to be positive touch, if you will. But just an interesting side fact, we have 1 million neurons in our gut, right? And that means that our brain is connected. It's a continual mind-body experience. And so to act like one doesn't affect the other would be a disservice.
Yeah, awesome. So, and if you didn't hear, Dawn has a TEDx talk available on trauma-informed mediation. It's available on YouTube. we've been asked if we can put together a list of resources. I'm happy to work with you, Dawn. I think I wrote them all down, but I'll
Okay.
make sure if we got everything. I might not have gotten those last two Dan Harris book titles, so we'll.
Yeah, you can just Google Dan Harris, and he has a podcast. He has an app. Shawn Achor was actually one of his client, or one of the interviewees, if you will. That's how I got introduced to Shawn Achor, and that's, it's just sort of the series of events in terms of all these resources. The audio books, listen to an audio, because it's actually fun. Listen to Dan Harris tell his own story on the audio book. Anyway, I always like that. I always like when the author.
Some good old Dan Harris. So it's good for your soul, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, we have another question real quick, that you said that talk therapy cannot heal the brain. So what can?
So EMDR is one of the helpful ones. Hypnotherapy is actually very effective too. Neurofeedback, which is what I do, and I'm not going to go into it because you guys will be like, what the? It is safe, but it does require an EEG of your brain. And I like I said, I show my brain in the TED Talk, and you can see how dysregulated parts of my brain were. And then the neurofeedback it's basically just EEG, and it regulates the brain waves from one sensor to the next. And so you just continually have these sensors all over your brain. But like I said, that's what they use to heal concussions. And because before there really was people just died, and they had these horrible deaths where they literally shoot themselves in the head because the brain couldn't heal itself. But when given the right parameters through something like neurofeedback, the brain can heal itself. And that ties into that beautiful word of neuroplasticity. I mean, we are really beautiful by design if you know how to heal. But like I said, then there's also somatic experiencing, which is more of the way to heal, have the brain body healing, but more through the body component. So you could Google, and the Body Keeps the Score book will talk about all of those resources, all of them, and the benefits of all of them too. And yoga and meditation, those are all helpful ways too.
And I also heard with coronavirus, we should just all start namasteing each other instead of shaking hands.
But yesterday I was introduced to a foot tap. So yeah, there's that.
And
yeah, go ahead.
Sharing imagery of your brain is probably about as self-disclosing as
you know what? So on a true level, I had a conversation with my husband, and I said, people are going to think I'm nuts, babe. And I'm going to get a little teary, but he goes, Dawn, right now, he goes, let's say 80 people like you. And he goes, those 80 people may not really know you though. And he goes, but let's say you share all of this with the world, and then you have 50% of people who really know you and love you anyway. It's worth sharing. And think about how many people that you can help. And I was like, I'm going to go with that.
I would go with that too.
That's what I've done.
Awesome. So thank you so much. I think that's it for questions.
Okay.
This webinar has been recorded and will be available on the SILA Foundation YouTube channel soon. I don't know exactly when, but shortly. And then the SILA Foundation provides these webinars free of charge to the public as part of our mission of education and outreach. If you liked what you heard today, be sure to let us know. You'll all be getting a post-webinar survey. Also consider supporting the SILA Foundation. We do outreach to the public, and we provide scholarships to worthy students who are entering our industry. And keep your eyes peeled for future webinars. We have a whole lot coming for the rest of the year from SILA Foundation. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Dawn. I think this was one of our best attended and very, very interesting.
Well, good.
Thank you. You can't thank you enough for doing this for us.
Yes, thank you.